Hi, this is Sarah Trott, and welcome back to the fourth trimester podcast. I'm joined today by my co-host, Esther Gallagher, and a special guest, Andrea Ford, who I will introduce in a moment. So today we're going to be talking about some of the hidden emotional and hormonal and social realities of becoming a parent and a mother, and why support during the postpartum period matters far more than most modern systems really acknowledge. Andrea is a former Bay Area doula, so she's American. Well, she's currently living in Scotland in the UK, and she is an anthropologist. She is also an author. She has written a book called Near Birth, Contested Values and the Work of Doulas, and she'll probably show us the book, talk a lot about it. So we're interested to hear more about that. And her work examines some of the invisible labor of caregiving, cultural expectations placed on mothers, and ways the support systems can shape maternal well-being. And she's also involved, I want to mention, in some really interesting stuff around femtech, research initiatives on reproductive health and endometriosis, and innovation in care systems. So, Andrea, keep on doing that. We need more of that. That's so cool. I'll mention a cool organization called 51 which is relatively new, and I want to put on your radar and for other people who are interested in that space to get involved and help kind of raise the bar. They're like, in America, they're like the AARP for women's health. In this conversation, we're exploring what postpartum families can learn from anthropology and just get a better understanding of women's lived experiences so we can help create a better world for future generations. But Andrea, we'd love to have you introduce yourself in your own words.
Great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of the podcast. It's lovely to speak with you. So as you said, I'm an anthropologist. I live in Edinburgh and work at the University of Edinburgh within the medical school. And I've been a doula since 2012 is when I trained. Practiced in the Bay Area, in Chicago, and then a little bit in the UK. So I have some kind of experiences across different places, which is always interesting. For people who are less familiar with anthropology, I'll say a word or two about what the point is. So study culture, which is the things that we take for granted and assume are normal or natural or common sense, but it steps back a little bit from them and wonders where they come from and whether they could be different. And I think that's really important during birth because there's so many judgments that fly, so many expectations, so many emotions, basically, that are wrapped up into the experience, and having a little bit of distance to ask questions about why is it like this from people that I've supported and spoken to, it can be really validating to not be in the mix, like to take a step back and kind of figure out where the pressures come from without feeling like they're yours to solve. It's like a personal problem, but then stepping back, you see it as a social and cultural problem. And that can be an interesting, different perspective for people.
Yes, that is really interesting because you're shifting kind of what's happening from like your own sphere to a much broader perspective.
Yeah, it makes it less like you're less likely to blame yourself for things, I think, or to, for me, well, as I mentioned in our chat, I'm pregnant myself with my first child. And so having had this research background and practice as a doula and coming into making decisions for myself, it really takes a lot of the pressure off to be able to kind of externalize the judgments that often attach to parenting choices, and makes it easier to connect with what feels good or what is interesting, like from a personal perspective, rather than feeling like there must be some kind of right way or there must be some kind of best thing that if I only knew what it was, I would be able to do it and then it would be fine. I guess.
Yeah, it's tempting to think that way that, oh, if I just follow this set of instructions or if I just know these steps, then it's all going to work out, right? There's this whole other level of ambiguity that's introduced, which is why we've had several topics actually focused on self-trust. So I wonder if that comes up in your work.
Yeah, definitely. I guess a lot of the times what ends up happening in my work is that there'll be something like self-trust or something like autonomy or equality. These are the kind of values or things that we think are good that the book talks about. But how do you actually do them can be quite tricky, right? Like how do you trust yourself? And why is that interesting or why is that important right now? Because in different cultural times and places, having something else to rely on can be really helpful. But in the way that we tend to think about making decisions and what's reassuring information, we tend to look inside a lot and look into the self, which feels good for cultural reasons. Does that make sense?
Yeah, like it's reinforced by kind of just the nature of the culture we're surrounded in.
Yeah, exactly. So it is a nice way of navigating what can be quite intense territory sometimes, but it's also not as easy for everybody. And having a perspective on like that itself, the value on self-knowledge and self-awareness is like a particular cultural thing, can kind of help take some pressure off of that as well.
Talk more about that. Like how? What does that mean?
Let's see. So in a lot of contexts, people approach reproduction as a way of like fulfilling a social role or continuing a heritage, right? So something that we don't tend to have a lot of in US, UK kind of modern cultures is doing things the way that our generational predecessors did. There's a really funny grandparenting class that was being taught at Stanford when I was doing field work, which is basically about like budding out and letting your kids do what they wanted to do, which is appropriate and can feel really helpful. But it's also kind of funny because grandparents as a source of knowledge in a lot of other places would be a really valuable resource. So sometimes, like anthropology identifies a lot of double-edged swords, and as good as it can feel to be able to chart your own way and connect with what you want, it can also feel overwhelming or alienating or like a lot of pressure. Like you have to sort of reinvent the wheel. And I guess it's not that I wouldn't want to be able to do that. You know, I'm not advocating for having to do things the way that my family or my parents did. There's some ways that I differ quite a lot from what they want, but I think it is a lot of pressure. And I guess what I think is useful to recognize is that in some ways we want to be autonomous and in some ways we want to be connected, and having both of those things and figuring out which one is appropriate when is something that anthropology, I suppose, can help with.
Yes. Yeah, we have had some in-depth conversations specifically on the grandparenting topic. And I'm glad you brought that up actually, because it is a fine line of respecting boundaries
Mm-hmm.
and also being available. And like having the communication around that is so key, was some of the takeaways that we've had from those prior episodes, because people will have different ideas around what they want that relationship to look like. And they might
Mm-hmm.
just assume, right? This is the way it is. Like, this is the way it was for me. This is the way I'll just move in. I'll just move in for 3 weeks. That's just going to happen. Right. And so you have to like actually just have the conversation. Like, I'm willing to do this. What would feel good to you? But it could be the opposite, right? Maybe the person giving birth wants their parent to move in and their parents like, I can't handle that. That's going to like bring
Yeah.
up all sorts of my own trauma from when I had birth. Like all these things could happen. But I think that it's one of those things where yes, budding out, but also having that conversation, because maybe your child who's having a baby wants you to come and
Mm-hmm.
be more involved.
Yeah. I think doulas are kind of interesting in that respect because they're like family members, but not. Right? They do a lot of things that family members might, in some contexts, be expected to do that are quite intimate, that are also kind of like therapists or best friends or nurses. And yeah, it's a professional relationship. So there's some distance there, which you don't usually have with a family member. So the kind of navigating, both autonomy and connection and interdependence, whether it's with a doula or a grandparent, is like a particular skill that you have to get kind of good at, I think, to navigate relationships in these cultural contexts.
Esther, I'm sure you have something to say on that one.
Well, I think everyone experiences autonomy and dependence, interdependence, and connection, and I think that it's the quality of those aspects of being a human being, and no doubt other species, but we'll be human centric for now, since it's called anthropology. Yeah, the capacity to kind of broaden our curiosity and shrink our prejudices is, an interesting interplay always in every moment of life, and of course certainly when we're going to be bringing another human into the mix. So yeah, and I will also just comment that I had children before I studied anthropology.
Hmm.
And before I became a midwife and then a doula. I think it does flip the script a little bit, for everyone involved. But that's the wonderful thing about being a doula is it's kind of wide open who gets to do it, and why they're doing it and how they're doing it. And, it's not strictly speaking in America bounded by licensure or that sort of thing, which is, I think, one of its primary values. So at every turn, I find myself thwarting those who would like to come in and determine what doula care is and determine who's a valid care provider and who is not, and all of those things. So, yeah.
It is interesting how midwifery, doula work, and anthropology often kind of overlap. Like a lot of people have studied multiple of those. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
empathy that goes into all of that type of work. Open-mindedness.
When I was in college, getting one of my 2 BAs, which was anthropology, every opportunity to write a paper or do whatever little research was focused on, whether it was physical anthropology, cultural anthropology, archaeology, whatever. It was always like, okay, how does reproduction and specifically birth and postpartum figure into this study? And yeah, it's interesting. The human relation area files are fascinating, especially about postpartum, because cultures will tell you or used to tell you, like, here's how we do it. Here's what's supposed to happen, even if that's not actually true in practice. There's rules.
Yes. Yes. That's I wouldn't say unique, but notable that we tend to ignore the postpartum period so heavily in
Yeah.
contemporary contexts. It's like so many people feel kind of just abandoned after they have the baby, and there's very little support, very little debrief, as of course your podcast covers in depth. The book that I wrote is called Near Birth. It's just here. And that's because the birth itself isn't necessarily the point. I mean, I think birth is fascinating, but how do you get there and what do you do afterwards are just as important.
So talk to us more about that.
So one of the chapters talks through equality and the idea that we value being equal to our partners, to our colleagues at work, having equal opportunities, the idea that we start from an equal playing field, or at least could equalize the playing field through certain measures. When I've taught gender studies, a lot of the women students don't experience themselves as on different footing than their male counterparts. And I pointed out that for many people that changes when they have children. I mean, many people do experience differences, but they're really marked when you have children. And when you are trying to navigate the postpartum period, the questions of different bodily capacities is just so front and center, particularly around infant feeding and recovering from birth. And so the value on equality, or the ideal of equality, just really breaks down culturally, I think, and it creates pressure Right. Pressure that people who've given birth think that they should be able to bounce back to some kind of normal or some kind of way they were before, that they should be able to, kind of cope without support because it's not talked about or offered readily. And you have to kind of learn new ways of asking for help or being dependent, which are uncomfortable. Because they're not how we've learned to be. I guess equality and autonomy kind of go hand in hand, right? If you are an individual, and that's the big theme that it keeps coming back to, thinking about people as individuals and birth as a way that culturally we make people into individuals, even though when you give birth, you're not an individual. You're really, really kind of interdependent with this other being. So it fits poorly, and that creates tensions and conflicts.
I really appreciated what you just said. For people who are listening to this, they're like, well, I'm not an individual. I am part of this structure. If they do want to influence that and create change, like what would be, like, what's your thinking around that?
It's a really good question. Sometimes pointing out the problem is a different thing than figuring out a solution. So, but it's a very apt question. I think, well, recognizing it is a first step, right? Like, recognizing that the expectation that you'll be the same after as you were before is maybe false. Like a lot of different cultural contexts acknowledge that this is a liminal period and a big transition. Lucy Jones published a book recently called Matrescence, which talks about the physical, emotional, spiritual transformation that becoming a mother is, and that we don't have a word for that. So matrescence is sort of like adolescence in her coinage, to recognize that this is a big transformation, and other cultures will have rites of passage that mark this as a transformation in a different way. Whereas in the US, UK contexts, there's really this assumption that you're a consistent person and you should be the same before as after, and including something like menopause. Like people talk about menopause in the way of like, I'm not myself anymore, which is disconcerting. Like, I'm not denying that, but allowing space for change and recognizing it is a different way of approaching that problem rather than trying to figure out how to go back to what you were before. So it's not that one's necessarily better or worse, but if you're stuck in this place where you're frustrated because you're not the same, then some gentleness around that being okay, or some kind of, anthropological insights about how to honor that or mark that transition or make it feel like a valuable thing instead of a loss can be really helpful. Yeah. So having been, equal, professional, independent person, and then having a baby and feeling all sorts of dependencies that are really uncomfortable, maybe that's an insight that can help. But again, it's not easy to stand outside of what we're taught to want culturally. However, when it's already kind of broken down because you're in a situation that doesn't, that we don't address well culturally, then maybe it can be helpful. But it's not a simple, straightforward answer because you're swimming upstream in that sense. Like, and when I'm looking at the femtech work, a lot of the that tension is there as well. It's like, do we want to develop technological solutions or innovations to make women fit better in what's expected of us, or do we want to think about ways we could change things so that the expectations are different? Which usually doesn't lend itself to like a tech quick fix.
I love that so much. Yeah, I mean, there's so many new companies, and especially like more funding recently,
Mm-hmm.
like venture fund been pouring into startups around women's health and the femtech space. But yeah, observing matrescence, understanding that word and what that means. Thank you so much for saying those things out loud. And then, I wonder if this course is going to relate to a theme that comes up often on this program around asking for help. Feeling that it's okay to ask for help. It's a strength. It's not a weakness.
Even something as simple as a meal train. My friends recently had a baby and asked for people to sign up to bring them meals. And it was amongst the kind of friend group, it was a conversation. Like, is that an okay thing to ask for? Is that something we're happy to do? And yes, we were, but it was like, a bit uncomfortable because asking people to do favors for you can be awkward. Yeah. But it's also like,
Can I something from, I'd like to read something from Audre Lorde, who
sure.
predates all of us in this room. Do you know who I'm speaking about? She's a poet and writer, African-American woman, famous to my generation for taking on feminism and racism. And she's quoted here, divide and conquer in our world must become define and empower. And the article goes on to say people must educate themselves about the oppression of others, because expecting a marginalized group to educate the oppressors is the continuation of racism and patriarchy. You know, I bring up those terms a lot on this podcast. I just, at my age and stage, and having watched things unfold and not unfold for so long, right, that could have unfolded, could have been redefined, you know, made equality and quality of experience for 52% of the population much more healthy and normalized. Such strong cultural thought and practice that mediates against women and bodies, people who define themselves in the feminine, at every turn. And it hasn't improved in my lifetime. We thought it was gonna, and then all this regression. So yeah, it's always good. I mean, I think having a word for matrescence is great. It's great. And I hope it pushes the needle. And I knew at 18 years old that there was a thing, right? It wasn't called a thing yet, but you know, anyone who goes through it knows that something is really transformational is taking place, you know, from the beginning and all the way through, and will continue. So while I'm thrilled and appreciate all of these angles and definitions and attempts, I think what's so curious is how much negative pressure there is in this particular culture that mediates anything and everything that ever happens. And that's probably true throughout the world. I haven't studied all cultures. But I think a defining feature of American culture is, and I think most women who find themselves in the postpartum transformation will say, if asked, that there's a sense of being disappeared. It's big and it's heavy, and whether or not it's intentional, outside forces are defining who we are and how we can behave in this space in a way that serves something that has nothing to do with us, and often our children. And so I know that's pretty bleak and pretty strong. And I know it's not everyone's experience, but I think it's significant enough. There's enough of us who would say, we're all worried about medicating postpartum depression, but we're not addressing the fundamental underpinning of why it happens in the first place, right? Something as simple as you just pointed out, which is, are we going to feed our friend when she's trying to heal and recover and establish breastfeeding relation? Why is that a question in our cultures, right? I mean, bless your hearts, it is a question, right? It's true that it is. Why it's not just, and that we call it a favor. I mean, you know, it's fascinating, isn't it? Like, that would not be considered a favor anywhere else, you know, most places, right? But it's a question about, do women matter?
Yeah. Well, and does raising children matter? I mean, absolutely.
Yeah.
Do women matter? Is reproductive labor important? Is it something that society benefits from? Or is it something that's an individual choice? We think about, you chose to have a child. But like, the repercussions and the positive ways that we're tangled together, because some people are doing this incredibly difficult work of raising children. It benefits everybody, or it affects everybody. It's not an individual choice and it's not an individual work. As you're saying, it should be obvious that we're all, that we should all care for this work, whether we engage in it in a way that's we're personally responsible for or not. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. It's not the most uplifting, but absolutely on point observation.
So I have to ask, are there any things that you've observed, like culturally different US versus UK in the space of postpartum that are worth highlighting?
So you standard have a home visit by the midwifery team in the UK. So that's a small kind of thing that can make a big difference. You don't have to strap your 2-week-old baby into the car seat and go to the hospital. You can just be visited by a care professional. So yeah, that's a small but particular difference that does make a difference for people. In general, having access to healthcare that is universal and free is, well, socially paid for, is a big difference. And I think that does matter to people. I think there's more similarities than differences. Well, I guess the other thing that's hugely different is that you have a year of maternity leave in most cases. So that's hugely helpful for people who are working. And in my personal experience, the expectation around taking leave is quite different. There's kind of an idea in the US that you want to get back as soon as possible, whereas people in the UK, very generally speaking, are like, oh yeah, see you in a year. Like, you get this time, you should absolutely take it. There's also...
and Andrea, could I jump in there? I'm sorry to interrupt,
please?
but what does that mean economically speaking, right? Like the expectation to get back to work in this culture is so that people don't fall into poverty, right? That we're fear-based around what might happen if we're not securely golden handcuffed to our work. And women especially, I think, in this culture, because there's no guarantee from the culture or any partnership they would have forged with a man that they will then have a standard of living if that should break. So when we talk about a year of leave in Europe or especially the UK, like what does that mean? Financially, right? Because that's not nothing. That's a huge problem in America that we ignore.
Yes.
Right.
America is one of like 3 countries that doesn't offer a standard universal maternity leave. It's insane. So when people here ask me about it, I usually point out how stratified America is. Like some people have generous jobs that allow them to have a feeling of security, and some people absolutely don't. And so the floor, there's no floor, there's no socially mandated floor. But even for people who do have generous jobs, workplace provisions, the sense of precarity, I think, is a bit stronger in the US, that like things might fall out from under you. And the UK is not a paradise by any means, but there are somewhat stronger worker protection provisions, so that it would be a big deal if you lost your job because you went on maternity leave. Whereas I don't think that's as protected in the US. I don't know the legal basis for specifically, and it will vary by state, etc. But what it looks like in the UK to take a year off, it's not fully paid, it's 9 months paid. And there's kind of like obnoxiously complex calculations around how much the state pays your salary versus how much your employer pays your salary based on how much you tend to earn. But that said, you earn enough to usually kind of maintain your standard of living for the year. And you can share the parental leave with a partner if you would like. So even if you have different workplaces, because it's organized at the government level, if you want to do 6 months and then 6 months, so you go back to work earlier if you're the birth partner, and your partner takes the baby for those next 6 months, so they learn how to care for them, etc. That's totally legal in most, and not only legal but like required to be offered most people. Or you can do what we're going to try to do is month on, month off, so that we both have a connection to our work, but also both spend a lot of time being responsible for the baby at the different life stage as she grows. So being able to do that is only something you could do if you have a government mandated policy. Like if it's workplace based, you can't have parental shared leave in that way. So that's a big difference. And then just, again, the UK is not a paradise, but it does have somewhat more of a safety net in terms of social supports, so that if you're, as you mentioned, like you need to rely on a partner in order to have economic standing and like a roof over your head, knowing that there's a few more things in place that could help you if that somehow falls apart is a huge relief from that sense of precarity that so many people in the US feel. The other thing is subsidized childcare. So again, not a paradise. It starts when they're 3, so it doesn't cover those 2 years when you're not on leave, but it's better than nothing. So yeah, helps a bit.
Well, thank you for highlighting those those differences, the compare and contrast. It's always interesting to hear. So what, when we think, I think we've talked a lot about like why emotional and relational support are really foundational to maternal health, but is there anything else, maybe from your book or just your observations, that you'd want to share that postpartum families could learn about that?
I think debriefing from the birth is quite an important thing. It doesn't in itself provide postpartum support, but a lot of people get overwhelmed very quickly by what postpartum life is like. And then whether the birth was beautiful or traumatic or a bit of both, it sort of sits as the elephant in the room for some people. So I wasn't trained as a postpartum doula and didn't work as a postpartum doula, but I would visit families once or twice or sometimes 3 times after the birth to process the birth, so that wasn't interrupting what they were trying to get on with, which is learning how to care for a tiny baby and integrate that baby into their life.
And what does that look like?
So people tend to, in my experience, people tended to remember the birth differently. Like 2 hours later, 2 weeks later, 2 months later, different, like literally the memory would be different. Like you would have forgotten something and then it would come back to you from what happened, whether just because you were overwhelmed or like it was so intense, or maybe it was awful and you blocked it out and it took a little while for it to reemerge. So there's just differences in how people remembered the birth. And so following up over time could help acknowledge that, and also like have an ongoing connection to someone who was part of the birth, for people to revisit things or ask questions as issues came up. It looked like I would often write kind of the story from my perspective. And then if they wanted, I would share with them. Not everyone. Well, actually, everyone that I spoke to wanted it, but I can imagine people wouldn't necessarily want someone else's memories like clouding their own or shaping their experience. But it was kind of a way of me bringing some details in that they might not have recognized at the time, which people seemed to appreciate. So sometimes I would share that narration. Sometimes there would be a lot of confusion about what happened. And my experience, and also like the body of scholarly work on this, is that it doesn't really matter what happens, like in terms of procedures or what your body does or doesn't do, barring some extreme examples. But if you felt respected and you felt cared for, you felt like you had a voice in the process, people tended to feel pretty good about their birth. Even if, they wanted a non-medicated home birth and they had an emergency C-section. It could be a very different, like, procedural outcome. But if they felt respected and they felt cared for and they felt like they were part of it, then that's just how it rolled out. Whereas even if it was a perfect birth that looked exactly like their birth plan, but they didn't feel listened to, or felt like it went too fast, or people were kind of unattentive in a way that was really just devalorizing. Like it could be quite a terrible experience that no one would identify from the outside was a terrible experience. So those kinds of nuances are what would usually come up in those debriefs.
Yes. I remember after one of my births, I'd brought a notebook, a journal with me, and I immediately just wrote down every little detail I could remember, because I knew that I might not necessarily remember it all in that amount of detail later. And I'm so glad I did. And I might go dig it up now after this conversation because I haven't thought about it in a really long time. But yeah, I love what you're saying, that it helps process it so you can move on.
Yeah, sometimes I've worked with doula clients who are expecting a second or third baby, and they realize when they're pregnant that they have all of this set of feelings from earlier births, and they want to process it now before they do the thing again. So it can stick around for a long time.
I still remember my birth. And I remember from my first birth, something that happened that no one ever acknowledged, but it really, really stuck with me. And all these years later, and it was being very disrespected and misunderstood, not by a care provider per se, but by my partner. And the way they reacted in that moment, I've never forgotten it. And it's not that I can't move on, but it is, I've always thought it's significant, right? It's significant that women remember the emotional tone of others deeply in those moments, and how whatever it is we're needing a response for or support through is remembered. My kids are going to be 50 and 45, like they're old people now themselves. And I remember details of their birth that no one ever acknowledged at all, but that just showed me something. And these were home births. I had wonderful support in the form of midwives, but in a way, no advocacy for the social emotional, like what's appropriate in a home birth setting, if somebody's being a jerk, like, how do we address that? And my experience is, well, we just don't, we just don't, and we don't know how, and I understand it. And it is what it is. But I appreciate that you would write a book about it, that you would study it and write about that the social emotional is real.
It's so
it's
medical experience.
And the spiritual is real, whether we are ever going to acknowledge it or not. It's there. It's with us. It's what's happening, and it's poorly held.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I include myself in that. I've been a doula my whole life, and it's not easy to navigate those moments with families. There's no training for it, really.
No, navigating like the emotional currents in the room and the power dynamics, whether it's with families, medical providers, often both at the same time, is so, as you say, there's no training for it. It's like an intuition, or
they're training about it.
Yeah.
Right. There's training about it. We hear that it's a thing. We hear that maybe somehow we're supposed to be responsible and do a certain number of things, like processing the birth, right? It's not that much of the training. We can get auxiliary training like somatic experiencing and, internal family systems, but those are things that psychologists, and people with degrees and things of that nature bring to the table, and are often auxiliary care, right? Like a doula would refer somebody for that kind of care and support.
There's a beautiful conversation that I guess that I'm having with other scholars and other birth workers, partially in the book, about intuition, which I think gets quite a bad rap, or like it's very romanticized that you should have intuition as a mother in particular, or as a doula, that you are an intuitive kind of care provider. When it's romanticized, it becomes like an expectation that puts a lot of kind of weird pressure on people. But it's actually just a very practical way of knowing that people learn through experience and through their bodies and through, as you say, being in the room, in the space where these sorts of tensions are happening. How do you deal with them? How do you navigate? How do you know, like, who to advocate for at a certain moment? Because if you fight somebody, it's going to create tension, which will actually harm your client. But if you don't stand up for them, they won't feel supported, and you're there to stand up for them. So very complicated things, like tensions, emotions, socio-emotional factors that you're trying to navigate. And you can't teach that as you say, you can have a kind of externalized intellectual system about it, which is very different from having been in the room enough that you can sense what needs to be done at the time. And I think that's a beautiful skill that we should value a lot more, the intuitive, without romanticizing it as something that just sort of comes to people. No, it's really based on having been there and having been in those situations, and so the experience and wisdom that comes with that. It would be nice if we valued it more than intellectual systems, or at least on par with. As an academic, I can't dismiss intellectual systems, but the intuitive and the embodied is at least equally important.
I love that. It's listening to your inner voice and knowing how to do that.
Mm.
And that is a skill that can be hard, to stop and listen, to say, something's not feeling right. What is that? And reflect on it in the moment rather than react. Yeah. Andrea, is there anything else that you want to leave with our listeners as some final thoughts?
I'll just repeat what I said at the beginning, that sometimes stepping back and getting a little bit of distance from the pressures and the stories that we get caught up in can be refreshing.
Great.
Yeah. Nice. Thanks so much.
Thank you both.
Great. Well,
with you.
yeah, we really love the conversation. We're so honored to have had you as a guest. Thank you so much. And we will put links to your book and other information in our show notes. But where can people find you and learn more about you if they want to follow up?
I'll send also a link to my profile, which has some of my academic work on it.
Okay.
Sweet.
Okay. Wonderful.
Nice.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.